All right, ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling something that I think everyone has an opinion on. Drug reform.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic.
Always sparks debate. Should drugs be legal? The war on drugs?
Hmm.
All that. But the source we're looking at today kind of flips the script a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah.
It argues that the dark web, that kind of like shadowy part of the internet,
Yeah.
might actually be helping us move towards a better way to deal with drugs.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Sounds a little
That
counterintuitive.
does sound a little crazy,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
let's unpack it.
Yeah, let's dive in. So the source starts off by really getting philosophical about this whole thing.
Okay.
Basically saying people should have the right to choose what they put in their bodies, even if it's drugs.
Okay, so like we let people eat unhealthy food even though we know it's bad for them, right?
Exactly.
So are they saying, where's the line then between what we choose to consume?
Exactly. They're pointing out that, like, why are some substances okay and others aren't? It's a really interesting comparison.
Yeah.
And it actually relates back to historical debates about, how much freedom should individuals have
Sure.
versus how much control the government should have.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it reminded me of this principle, John Stuart Mill's harm principle.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Refresh my memory, though.
Yeah, so basically it says that we should only restrict individual freedom when it's to prevent harm to other people.
Okay.
And this comes up a lot in these discussions about drug use, right? Like, if someone's using drugs and they're not hurting anyone else, should they be allowed to do that?
Okay, so this source is applying that principle to drug use, basically.
Exactly. And they're even going further. They're calling out what they call public health hypocrisy.
Okay.
They point out that more people die from obesity-related issues each year than from drug overdoses.
Wow, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and it makes you think, if we're really talking about reducing harm,
Right.
why aren't we tackling things like fast food with the same energy as we tackle illicit drugs?
That's a really good point. They both have serious dangers, but society treats them totally differently.
Exactly. And that difference in response is something the source really wants us to think about. But here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
The dark web.
All right, so the dark web.
Yeah.
Most people, when they hear dark web, they think criminals, illegal stuff, right?
Right.
Not exactly. Like a place you'd associate with helping people.
Exactly. But the source makes this argument that dark web drug markets could actually be making things safer
Really?
than buying drugs on the street.
Okay.
So, for example, there's this platform called Dread, and on Dread, instead of like shady street corners, you have vendor ratings and reviews.
Oh, interesting.
Users can actually see what other people's experiences have been like buying from specific sellers.
Oh,
And get this, there are even drug testing services, so you can make sure what you're getting is actually what it's supposed to be.
so you're saying there's more accountability and transparency on the dark web than on the street.
Exactly. If a vendor wants to keep selling, they have to have a good reputation.
Makes sense. So it's kind of like encouraging safer practices by like having that built-in accountability.
Precisely. And because everything happens online, there's a level of anonymity
Right.
that could actually lead to less violence.
Oh, I see.
No more perf wars
Yes.
or, face-to-face confrontations.
Okay, so are they saying then, like, kids are less likely to get drugs if it's all online?
Well, they do bring up that to even get on the dark web, you need some technical know-how.
Right.
It's not as simple as just meeting a dealer on a street corner.
I see, yeah.
So, again, they're not saying drug use is a good thing. They're just highlighting how complicated this whole issue is.
Right.
And how the dark web is sort of changing the game.
Okay, so they're not condoning it, just pointing out all these different factors we need to consider.
Exactly. And it makes you question, what if our attempts to shut down the dark web are actually pushing people back to more dangerous ways of getting drugs?
Yeah. That's a good point. And then they go on to say, maybe we should decriminalize drugs
Right.
and have regulated markets like we do with alcohol.
Exactly. That's something we'll explore more as we go deeper.
Okay.
But before we move on, I'm curious, what stands out to you so far? What are your initial thoughts on this whole idea that the dark web could be pushing us towards a better way to deal with drugs?
Well, to be honest with you, it's definitely making me think differently about the dark web. I've always thought of it as a bad place, but the way they're presenting it, it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's making me wonder if maybe there's more to it than meets the eye.
Right. And that's exactly what they're trying to do, challenge our assumptions.
Yeah?
And make us think critically about this whole issue.
Okay, so let's dive deeper into this. What else does the source have to say?
Yeah, it is kind of a mind shift. thinking about the dark web that way. But you mentioned decriminalization and like regulated markets
Yeah.
like we have for alcohol. That seems like a pretty big change, right?
It is, and the source gets that, but they say that the system we have now, the war on drugs,
Right.
it just hasn't worked. They point out that we've been trying to prohibit drugs and cracking down on them for decades,
Yeah.
but people are still using drugs.
So we're basically spending all this money and effort on something that isn't really fixing the problem.
That's what they're saying, yeah.
Yeah.
And they even suggest that there are some powerful groups that actually benefit from keeping things the way they are.
Like who?
They mention the private prison industry as an example. They make money when people are incarcerated for drug offenses.
Oh, wow.
So it makes you wonder, are these decisions about drug policy really being driven by public safety or by money?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So what are they suggesting we do instead? Well, they're asking us to really think about what a good ethical approach to drugs would look like.
Okay.
One that focuses on actually helping people instead of punishing them.
So instead of treating drug users like criminals, we should treat them like people who might need help.
Exactly. They're advocating for a system where we treat drugs like other potentially harmful substances, like alcohol or tobacco.
Okay, but aren't those different? I mean, people drink alcohol socially. It's pretty accepted.
True, but remember that harm principle we talked about earlier. It's about focusing on whether someone is harming others, not just whether something is inherently bad.
Right, right.
And the source says that regulating drugs could actually make them safer.
Okay, how so?
Well, imagine if drugs were produced and sold under strict regulations with quality control and accurate information about dosage.
Okay. Yeah.
We could even use the taxes from legal drug sales to fund things like rehab programs and public health initiatives.
Kind of like how we tax alcohol and tobacco, right?
Exactly.
So it sounds like they're proposing we treat drug addiction as a public health issue, not a criminal one.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And they point out that this approach has worked before. Think about the end of Prohibition in the U.S.
Right.
That was partly because people realized that making alcohol illegal was just creating a dangerous black market.
So they're saying that by criminalizing drugs, we might actually be making things worse.
It's something to think about, right? The source even goes as far as to predict that these online marketplaces, like the ones on the dark web, might actually force governments to reconsider legalization as a way to get back some control over the drug trade.
Wait, are they saying that the dark web could lead to legal drug markets?
It's a bold prediction, but they make a pretty compelling case. They argue that as these online platforms get more sophisticated and more people have access to them, authorities might realize that legalization and regulation is the only way to deal with the reality of the situation.
That's really interesting. It kind of turns the whole narrative on its head. Instead of the dark web being the problem, it could be part of the solution.
Exactly. It forces us to re-examine our assumptions and think about whether the way we're approaching this issue is actually working.
Okay, so we've talked about personal freedom and public health, and now even the economics of the drug trade. And this idea that the dark web could actually be a driving force for change.
That's a lot to take in, right?
It is, yeah. It seems like the source is really pushing us to think critically about all of this.
They are, and it's clear they don't have all the answers.
Right.
But they're urging us to have open and honest conversations about drug reform.
But wouldn't legalizing drugs just lead to more people using them, especially kids? I feel like that's the biggest argument against it.
It's a valid concern, but the source says we need to go beyond those kinds of fears and look at the evidence.
What do you mean?
Well, they're saying, let's look at what's happened in places that have already decriminalized or legalized some drugs.
Oh, yeah.
What does the data say about drug use, addiction, and public health?
So they're saying we need to base our decisions on facts, not just assumptions or what we're afraid of.
Exactly. We need to have a more nuanced conversation, one that recognizes that this is a complex issue and there's no simple solution.
Yeah, it is a really complicated issue. It feels like our whole society is built around these ideas about drugs.
It is, and that's why this source is so thought-provoking. They're asking us to question those fundamental beliefs and consider if there might be a better way.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the philosophy behind this, the health implications, the economics, and even the role of the dark web. What else does this source have to say? You mentioned earlier that the source dives into, like, the financial side of all this.
Yeah.
It seems like we always talk about, like, the moral stuff or the social stuff, but not really the economics of drugs.
Right, and that's something the source really emphasizes. Remember that number we mentioned before, like $400 billion in the global drug trade every year?
Yeah, that's insane. It's like impossible to even picture that much money.
It's a massive amount of money, and it's all happening outside of, like, any legal system or regulations.
So what they're saying is, like, what if that money was actually taxed and regulated?
Exactly. Imagine what we could do with that kind of revenue.
Yeah.
The source talks about using it to fund public health programs, addiction treatment, even education to prevent drug use in the first place.
It's almost like taking the money away from the criminals
Right.
and using it to actually fix the problems that drugs cause.
It is kind of like poetic justice in a way.
Yeah.
And it's similar to the sin tax idea we already have for things like alcohol and cigarettes.
Right.
By taxing those things, we can generate revenue and maybe even discourage people from using them too much.
Okay, I see what they're getting at.
Yeah.
But it still feels like a huge leap to go from where we are now to, like, buying weed at the store next to the beer.
It is a big change, but the source thinks it might not be as far off as we think. They believe these hidden online markets we talked about, the ones on the dark web, could actually force governments to make that change.
Oh, how so?
Well, as those platforms become more popular and harder to shut down, governments might realize that legalizing and regulating drugs is the only way they can actually get control of the situation.
So instead of trying to fight the dark web, we could use it to our advantage.
Exactly. It's about adapting to new realities.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. Okay, so even if all that happens, even if we accept that the way we're doing things now isn't working, aren't there still risks with legalization? Like, won't more people start using drugs, especially young people?
It's a valid concern, and the source addresses it. They say we need to be realistic but also compassionate.
Okay.
We need to look at the evidence from places that have already tried. Things like decriminalisation.
So, like, actually study what's happened in those places.
Right. What does the data say? Has drug use gone up? What about addiction rates?
So basically making decisions based on facts, not just our fears.
Exactly. Having a more nuanced conversation.
This is a lot to think about, it feels like. Changing our whole attitude towards drugs.
It is, and that's why this source is so important. They're challenging us to really examine our beliefs.
Yeah.
And see if maybe there's a better path forward.
I have to admit, I came into this whole deep dive with a lot of skepticism. But you know what? This source has really made me think.
Me too. And that's what we want these deep dives to do, make you question things, look at things from different angles.
So where do we go from here? Like, what can people actually do to be part of this conversation?
Well, the source ends with a call to action. They're urging us to stay informed, to talk about these issues with each other, and to advocate for policies that put people's health and well-being first.
So it's not just about waiting for the government to do something.
Right.
We all have a responsibility to educate ourselves.
Exactly. And that's the great thing about these deep dives. They give us the knowledge to start having those conversations.
I think we've definitely done that today. We've explored the philosophy, the health aspects, the economics, and even how the dark web fits into all of this.
It's been a really fascinating exploration.
It has.
Yeah.
I know this is what I'm going to be thinking about for a while. And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep learning.
Yes.
Keep researching and form your own opinions. Because at the end of the day, it's up to all of us to shape the future of drug policy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds open and keep asking questions.